All right, I know y'all are fed up with me, but hopefully we'll persevere. This, I think, was a panel that I was really interested in moderating and talking to three experts because my grandmother is a caregiver for people with Alzheimer's. So I want to start just for personal, selfish reasons. I want to hear about each of your experiences in caregiving, with caregiving, and how the arc of those careers has shaped what you do and why we're here. We can start with Sarita.
Sure, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much. So I am a family caregiver to a father with Alzheimer's. My mother also has pretty severe arthritis and mobility issues, and they both live with me. And I often refer to myself as a sandwich generation family caregiver because I'm also raising my daughter, who's 8 years old. And if I'm really honest with you, it feels like a panini generation. I'm a bit squeezed, really trying to balance the needs on both ends of the spectrum. I guess what I'll share is that I've learned through this experience that we need so much more of a care infrastructure to support families. There's not enough affordable and accessible care options that are available. There aren't enough supports for family caregivers, let alone working. Like I work full-time family caregivers. And we don't have enough of the home-based workforce that we need to really support families to be able to ensure that their loved ones can age with dignity. And I guess the only other thing I'd say is it's really hard. I mean, caring for somebody with Alzheimer's is a deeply emotional journey. To watch somebody that you love slip away, slowly, and the emphasis that my family, my brother, sister, and I have had to put on really caring for my mother as his primary caregiver and her many needs. It's a real emotional toll. It's a big financial commitment. And it doesn't have to be this hard. And that's why I do the work that I do.
Jay?
So my dad was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's at the age of 58 when I was still a senior in college. And I'm an only child, and my mother cared for him for the first 10 years after his diagnosis. But like 40% of ADRD caregivers, the stress of caregiving, like he would follow her everywhere, follow her to the bathroom. She had no time off, and she really wouldn't express to anybody. She wouldn't sort of tell anybody how bad it was, and I would constantly say to her, you need to get help. She really wouldn't listen to me. She was like, no, I can handle it. She ended up dying of a stress-induced brain aneurysm 10 years after his diagnosis at the age of 59. And so in 2011, I became my father's primary caregiver. And I moved my dad up to Washington. I tried very briefly to take care of him myself. That turned out to be disastrous on a lot of levels. From, part of the fact was that he thought I was my mother a lot and would, propose constantly, publicly, which was very sweet that they had such a great marriage, but a little less sweet when he was like trying to make out with me. He would go for walks with my dog, and 5 hours later, police and fire would find him miles away. He would try to cook in the house, and he was used to an electric stove in Florida, and he would turn on the stove in the house, and it was gas, and I'd come home to like a house full of gas. And so it became pretty clear early on that I wasn't going to be able to handle taking care of him. And I had a whole new perspective on what my mother had gone through caring for him and how much it took. And so I eventually moved him into a community, and when I did, they asked me to fill out this like 20-page questionnaire about his life, and I was sitting there writing down these answers thinking, I was a professional writer with Time magazine at that point, and I challenge anybody to describe their parents' 50-plus year marriage in 4 lines. And then secondly, who was ever going to read and remember 20 pages of like handwritten data points for like the 100-plus residents in that particular community? Nobody, right? So instead I said, look, I think it's easier for me and easier for you as a writer if you just let me write down his story. And I did, and I printed it out. It was 1 page, double-sided, handed it out to all of his caregivers, and I was like, this is my dad, because he really couldn't tell his story very much anymore on his own. And they loved it. They remembered it. They told each other about it. Two of his caregivers were Ethiopian, and they'd had no idea that he'd actually lived in Ethiopia for 4 years early on in his career with the United Nations, and they became his champions. They would sit for hours and ask him about what it was like to work with Emperor Haile Selassie and what was the Empress like, and he loved it because he remembered Africa from his early 20s pretty well, even if he often didn't remember last week. So MemoryWell, my startup, grew out of that experience, and we now have more than 600 writers across the country. We're working in 14 states and 33 communities. We work directly with assisted living facilities and continuing care retirement communities like Brookdale here to replace sometimes large swaths of those questionnaires, but also augment and tell those life stories to better connect both caregivers and family, frankly, to everybody to each other within those communities. And we have a digital platform where families can then add in their photos and music and movies. So whomever is sitting with them, whether it's a paid caregiver or a grandchild, they have a whole toolbox of things with which to engage that person.
Juliet?
Thanks for having me. My journey is really a professional one. I started volunteering in nursing homes in the early 80s when I was in high school, and was really intrigued by the folks that I saw living not a very good life with dementia. And back in those days, folks were tied down and drugged and really not well cared for. And I think I found a calling in that volunteer opportunity. And I've been working in residential dementia care ever since. Its evolution has really come from long-term care nursing home settings. I worked in the first secured unit setting in Iowa. And after grad school, went into assisted living, and that's where I've been since. So a 30-plus year career in really designing environments, working with the people who do read those questionnaires, and making sure they read those questionnaires. So really working at Brookdale, we have 520 communities that offer dementia care. So we're across the country, and really making sure that those programs are as state-of-the-art as they can be. I truly believe that programming and care is the treatment for the symptoms. That doesn't get talked about a lot. We're always looking for a cure. I think the program is the pill, but we can talk more hopefully about the programming as we go.
Well, we will talk more about the programming right now.
Yeah.
I did want to ask, when Juliet, you and Jay were talking about collaboration, about the programming, it seems that when we talk about state-of-the-art, a lot of the state-of-the-art involves issues of empathy, of figuring out how to build an empathic connection between caregivers, between patients, and between families and communities.
Yeah.
Where are we headed on that front?
Well, I think when I first started in this work and designed training for Carepartners, caregivers, we called them then, we really focused a lot on plaques and tangles and the science of the disease and the damage to the brain. And that didn't get us where we needed to be. I think that didn't foster a lot of empathy in our caregivers. And I think our training has come a very long way. We now focus on, really making sure that we're not hiring, we're selecting folks to work in dementia care, and that we're hiring for characteristics like empathy and the ability to build a relationship. We can train the skills, but I'm not sure you can train empathy. I think you have to really select the right person to begin with.
I just know from my personal experience, communities like Juliet's where people actually read the questionnaires are pretty rare. And certainly in my dad's community, they sat in a binder and gathered dust, and really nobody knew anything about anyone, and it was really isolating. And so I would visit my dad, and he had this best friend named Warren, and he and Warren would hang out all day long, and he had then a series of girlfriends, and I wanted to know about them. I was like, who are these people hanging out with my dad? And I would ask the staff, and I'd be like, who are these people? And they'd be like, I have no idea. And so I really felt like it was just such a lack of community, and I felt like we really nobody understood anything about anybody everybody. There was huge amounts of staff turnover. People were constantly coming and going, and that churn led to a lot of really disjointed care where nobody really knew anything about anyone. And I felt like, for me, MemoryWell and telling these stories, finding out about my dad's girlfriends and about Warren's life and other people, helped me kind of connect with him, see what he was going through, like really work with him. And it made me want to connect with their families too and get to know them. And we would all sort of help support each other in ways that I don't think we would have if we hadn't known each other, where I knew that Warren's family would bring my dad cupcakes when they came for Warren's birthday now because they knew my dad and they were sort of became friends with him. And I would go check on Warren when, you know, his wife couldn't make it. And so it created much more of a community. And so what I love when people do with our stories in communities is when they actually print them out and hang them up on walls. And so you can go into a corridor and read about each person and understand each other, because I think that there's just, you know, especially with a lot of the workforce not, you know, having very high levels of education, a lot of them potentially not even speaking the same language. There's just so much disconnect in this system, and it's, you know, and it's really problematic for the care.
Sarita, I'm also interested in empathy when it comes to family and informal in-home caregivers. My grandmother began her career as an informal caregiver in Jim Crow, North Carolina. Yeah. So empathy is a big part of the equation. What parts of our infrastructure are we developing, our understanding of how everything works, to increase empathy, to increase how we treat caregivers, and also how that's reciprocated with the care given to patients?
Yeah. Well, I think we have to start by actually valuing care and caregiving, which is really very undervalued in our society and in our culture. Just like you talked about your grandmother, I work through Caring Across Generations. We work with many family caregivers, unpaid family caregivers, but also a lot of the paid home-based direct care service workers. And, you know, when you talk to home care workers, part of what they say is they have a real passion for this work, but the work is so undervalued. It's very invisible. I mean, we're talking about some of the most vulnerable workers in our nation, making poverty wages, about $9 an hour on average, about $13,000 a year. 30% of them, you know, depend on public assistance for food security. They lack benefits. They depend on Medicaid for healthcare. And many of them are mothers themselves, daughters themselves, you know, grandmothers themselves, who aren't clear how they are going to care for themselves or their own families. And again, what we've been trying to do through our work at Caring Across Generations is to use the power of storytelling, but also to use the power of really valuing caregiving relationships in ways that expands empathy, but also recognizes and values that there is a growing home-based workforce that actually needs to be valued in our society with actual training and career pathways. We should professionalize this arena of the workforce, and that's a lot of the work we're starting to do. And I'm excited. There's actually a lot of momentum across the country right now that is both speaking to the demand that more of us have of wanting to age at home in our communities, but that means we actually have to address the other side of the equation, which is having a workforce that can complement and support family caregivers as well.
So, Juliet, one of the themes, the emerging theme that seems to be of this event is we are sort of accelerating our understanding of Alzheimer's and dementia. We are getting to a point now where we are implementing standards and figuring out what should be the usual standard of care for patients. How is the development of standards and figuring out what training approaches there are for caregivers? How's that going, and how are you implementing that in Brookdale?
Well, we would not be successful if it weren't for standardization of what it is we do with 520 locations. It has to be written down. It has to be audited. It has to be quality controlled. So I'm a firm believer in standards. I think we've been at Brookdale providing person-centered care for over a decade, but I think person-centered care is truly the gold standard, should be the gold standard. I think, we have a field that's catching up to that. I think we have an evidence base that's catching up to that. The Alzheimer's Association recently released dementia care practice recommendations solely around person-centered care, and has actually just launched a provider roundtable, and that has many of the largest dementia care providers, not just in assisted living, but in long-term care and home health settings as well. And I think, the more we collaborate and the more we raise the bar, the better care will be, and not just, residential, private pay, assisted living care, but all kinds of cares. I mean, collaborations are happening all over the place, and so I think that's definitely part of the hope, for sure, is that living with dementia is a better experience today than it was 5 years ago even.
So I want everybody to come up with your questions now, and I'll ask one more to Jay. It seems to me that your work is so vital in a world where health literacy is so dependent on class and your ability to actually deal with these things. And also, the reason why Alzheimer's and dementia, one of the reasons why they're so devastating and poor in communities of color, is because so much of storytelling, so much of our generational memory is oral. It's not written down. There aren't records for everything. How have those factors informed your work? And are there ways to maybe export them to other sectors of our caregiving experience and of the healthcare industry?
Totally. So, we're beginning to launch, and we're doing some studies, academic studies. We're going to partner with Brookdale for one of them. Actually, we're launching it this week in Westlake, in a grant funded by Howard Buffett, to begin to understand the power and the impact of storytelling. But if we can show, as I think we will hopefully down the road, be able to show that we can have an impact on the amount of prescription drugs used in these settings, both in home health and in assisted living, then we can really begin to permeate the system, because CMS will begin to provide us to both Medicare and Medicaid and other things. And that's really important because the Medicaid populations, I think, are some of the most vulnerable in the country, and they have so little support. There's almost nothing in terms of dementia-specific programming and care that is in Medicaid, and it's just sort of basic skilled nursing that kind of blankets everything. And it's really important when you have dementia and Alzheimer's that you get specific care to your disease. It isn't like you can't treat it the same way that you would treat cancer or heart disease or anything else like that. And so I do think that we've worked with Native Americans to do storytelling projects with them where we do oral histories. We've worked with we had this great fun sort of project where we still haven't launched yet, but they approached us, and I really love to do it. It's a quilting bee for a bunch of African American ladies from actually North Carolina. Hopefully they will survive the storm. And they have had this amazing oral history of years and years and years of together, and this quilting kind of society of telling life histories and really supporting each other and remembering different aspects of their histories. I think there's a large role that you can play with churches in this, where churches really begin to collect community histories. There's so much that I think can be done in terms of storytelling and partnerships. And I think it's so important to capture these stories. We really, as a journalist, what I do at Time is to tell the stories of the 1%, right? The wealthiest, richest, most famous people on the planet. MemoryWell really begins to invert that model. And whether it's Humans of New York or MemoryWell or others, I think the idea of microjournalism and beginning to collect everybody else's stories and finding commonalities and trends and interests in that is really powerful. And I think that to some degree, it's the future of journalism. And I think that there's a lot there that we can, explore and grow, especially in the day of fake news.
It's also, can I just add one thing, it's also so important to, going back to the piece I raised about the value of care, like actually making care and caregiving visible and understanding that actually care isn't issue that impacts all of us. And we have a collective interest in creating the kinds of supports that we need to ensure that our loved ones or ourselves are getting the kinds of care that we want to be able to age and live with dignity. And I think that's storytelling is such an important component of that. It certainly has informed a lot of the kind of work we've done in states. So through storytelling, actually in Maine, it's what propelled us. Right now we're advancing a universal home care ballot measure in Maine to ensure that 10,000 aging seniors and Mainers with disabilities have access to home-based care. That would never have happened without this kind of storytelling and connection and helping us all realize how important this issue is.
Let's go for one question we have over here.
Hi, Tim Regan with Senior Housing News. My question is for you, Julia. Earlier you had mentioned that treatment and care is more of this pill. So much today we've heard about a cure for Alzheimer's. It sounds like your philosophy is that treatment and care is the real cure, if you could call it that. I was hoping that you could sort of elaborate on how Brookdale does that for its residents and its memory care population.
Well, that's a 2-hour class, and you're welcome to join us. Programming and care is not a cure. Programming and care, I believe, is the way to alleviate symptoms. And I think that what we know in dementia care about creating positive environments, creating supportive environments, creating a positive physical approach with our caregivers, teaching care associates about communication, all of the programming that we do based on people's life stories and the person-centered approach that we have, I think is the best approach to living well with the disease. It's very difficult, I think, for that to be created in the private home on a consistent basis, especially as the disease progresses. And I do think that that's why our environments are special and different, and have to be special and different. There's so much that goes into the symptom management of this disease. It's psychological, it's psychiatric, it's medical. There's an occupational therapy component. We have to, we have a very structured dining program. All of those things have gone into the daily life of those folks living with the disease, and that I think is very difficult to recreate at home.
Well, I think, Juliet, one thing you said today that is going to stick with me, you introduced me to the term care partner. Yeah. As the terms have evolved from caretaker to caregiver to care partner, and thinking more about how the dynamic actually works, and how empathy is sort of a back and forth thing. So thank you for that. I'll put it in my writing now, and thank you, Jay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.